Assalamu alaikum, everybody. My name is Jalal Khashib. I'm Senior Research Associate at CIGA, the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, based here in Istanbul, Sabahattin Zaim University. Welcome all to the second session of our third international conference on Islamophobia, examining the global war on terror, challenges, policies, and consequences. Our colleague, Dr. Ubied Ruff, will moderate this session. And Dr. Ubied Ruff is a research fellow and editor at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, and assistant to the director at Istanbul Zaim University. He is an attorney by profession, and he got his PhD in law from Creighton University in the United States, and he has long experience in the field of Islamic banking and finance. Also, he has completed leadership training in Islamic banking and finance at Clare College, University of Cambridge in UK, religious studies and Arabic law in Quds, Palestine. Dr. Ubied, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Jalal, for the kind introduction. I apologize to everybody for too many attorneys on this panel, but it's unavoidable. It's necessary because of the world. It's necessary. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's 2021, and we are still on Zoom. In this situation, this is also to our benefit, as so many of our colleagues are scattered around the world. On behalf of our director, Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, here in Istanbul, Turkey, welcome everyone to this panel. Today, we have a very interesting topic, personal to many people, very sensitive topic as well, Islamophobia and domestic control of targeted minorities. Islamophobia and domestic control of targeted minorities. We have an excellent panel of speakers today. We will begin with Steve Downs. Stephen Downs is an attorney. He graduated from Cornell Law School. He has experience removing dishonest judges and disciplining bad judges. He was part of the defense team in United States versus Yassin Arif, and he's a founder of Project Salam, which has analyzed many hundreds of the post 9/11 terrorism cases. He prepared a monumental, very detailed, comprehensive report entitled Inventing Terrorists. This is must reading in this topic. He is currently executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedom, and he's currently the chair of the board of Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Stephen, we will begin with you, and then after you, we will go to your colleague, Kathy. I'll introduce each speaker before they begin. If you can, please keep your time to 18 to 20 minutes. I anticipate many questions. Please, everybody, you can submit your questions through the comment section, and they will be forwarded to me. And at the end of all of the speakers, we anticipate having time for question and answer. Dr. Downs, Stephen, the floor is yours. Remember to unmute as well. There we are.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think this is a great topic today, domestic control of targeted minorities. Kathy and I wrote a report about this back in 2014, and then again it was updated in 2019. And I'm going to lay the table basically for her to talk about the report. I want to talk about a bigger picture about the war on terror. In America, as in most multicultural nations, when dominant groups feel threatened, there is a tendency to revert to tribal thinking. We claim we must protect our dominant group, our white tribe, by directing discriminatory racist policies against other tribes. This protection of the dominant white group has been true in US since the days it was founded. Discrimination and racism against African Americans was embedded in America's Constitution after the Revolution. Discrimination and racism against Native Americans is embodied in America's repeated theft of their lands. To pick out two recent examples, during World War II with Japan, the US government moved some 100,000 West Coast Japanese Americans, many with American citizenship, to concentration camps thousands of miles from home on the vague, unproven theory that some Japanese Americans might be disloyal and secretly support Japan. The US government has since apologized for this outrageous action, which clearly violated the rights guaranteed to all Americans. In the 1970s, the US government, feeling threatened by advocates of Black power, allowed the FBI to harass African Americans by illegal methods, including the bringing of false criminal charges and several assassinations of Black leaders. The program, called COINTELPRO, was discovered and ended after a citizens group burglarized an FBI office and stole the files exposing the COINTELPRO program. The US government has since apologized for this outrageous program, which violated the rights guaranteed to all Americans. So it's not really surprising that this pattern would continue. After 9/11, the US followed the same pattern when a terrorist attack on New York City and Washington caused the government to feel threatened. The US government responded by launching what became known as the War on Terror, involving the invasion of Muslim countries abroad, and a program at home similar to COINTELPRO of intimidating and suppressing the Muslim American community. The War on Terror at home was based on the false assumption that Muslim Americans were potentially disloyal to America and might provide support for terrorism, similar to the false assumptions about Japanese Americans during World War II. It was also falsely assumed that there was such a large number of potential Muslim terrorists in America that they could only be located by massive surveillance of Muslim communities and torture to extract information, both of which were illegal under US law. Moreover, the War on Terror required large numbers of terrorists attacking America at home to justify the illegal surveillance, torture, and America's invasion of Muslim countries abroad. In fact, most individuals charged with terrorism by FBI were innocent Muslims that the FBI had manufactured into terrorists, inflating the number of terrorists captured in America, supposedly justified the repression of civil rights and the invasion of Muslim lands abroad, preferably those countries with lots of oil and other valuable resources. Kathy Manley and I became aware of this fake war on terror in our hometown of Albany, New York, when we became involved in the defense of a local imam named Yasin Arif, who was charged with material support for terrorism and money laundering. By the end of the trial, Yasin was convicted and sent to jail for 15 years, and we were convinced that the government had deliberately convicted an innocent man. The prosecution explained that the FBI had no evidence that Yasin was a terrorist, but they said he had the ideology. According to their exact language, in order to preempt anything from happening, they entrapped him in a sting. We began to call such fake convictions preemptive prosecutions, prosecuting innocent Muslims before they committed a crime. We found hundreds of such fake prosecutions of Muslims all across America, created as a way to intimidate the Muslim communities and justify the war on terror. We learned that for most of these fake prosecutions of Muslims, there were local groups of supporters, Muslim and non-Muslim, who understood that the defendants were innocent and had been wrongfully convicted. These supporters were outraged that the FBI had done such an injustice to their innocent neighbors, destroying communities and leaving families to suffer without a husband and children to grow up without a father. Dr. Sami Al-Arian himself, a political prisoner at the time, with great courage and insight, brought many of these small groups together and formed a new organization, now called the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. For a time, I was the executive director of CCF, and now I'm the board chair of the board of directors. My colleague, Kathy Manley, is the legal director of CCF. Dr. Sami's daughter, Lena Alarian, is now the executive director of CCF, and Mel Underbaki, who formed a group to support Dr. Sami Alarian during his political prosecution, is the deputy director of CCF. So we have long ties going back to the Alarian family and to their story, which I will highlight profile at the end of this. The mission of CCF is to care for the needs of more than 200 prisoners who have been preemptively prosecuted and also their families. To the prisoners, we provide legal and humanitarian assistance and annual Ramadan gifts to hundreds of prisoners to let them know they have not been forgotten. To the families, we gather them together for conferences and to heal and to deal with their particular needs as they come up. Many of them, for example, have been shunned and barred from the mosques and have really no community to support them. Our goal is to try to move them from victimhood to empowerment. We also seek to educate the public about the injustices that have been done primarily to the Muslim community and to reform the law so that these abuses will no longer happen. Now, 2 decades after 9/11, CCF has celebrated its 10th anniversary as a civil rights organization, and we as a country are approaching the 20th anniversary of the War on Terror. This year, CCF will begin a campaign to finally end the war on terror by dismantling the legal structure that created it. It was started by legislation, and it will only be ended by legislation. But that means dealing with the US Congress, which itself is deeply split ideologically, and I would say is at a kind of a tipping point. It could either fall back into old repressive, racist, colonial thinking, or it could move ahead into a new era of international collaboration, and at home generate humane immigration policies, criminal justice reform, and a dismantling of the racist beliefs that have so deeply stained its policies. It's too early to tell which way things may go, but CCF is determined to be part of this legislative discussion and struggle. So here are 6 pieces of legislation that I believe need to be repealed or amended in order to end the war on terror. And these are ones that we plan to focus on. The first item that I think we need to do is to repeal the Patriot Act. This was the basic underlying act for the war on terror that was passed hastily after 9/11 before most legislators had even read it. It sets out the parameters for a new era of intervention abroad and repression at home. It creates new unnecessary terrorism crimes and permits the US government to subject Muslim communities to intensive levels of surveillance, entrapment, and preemptive prosecution. Number 2, repeal congressional authorization to use military force against Al-Qaeda. In 2001, in response to the 9/11 attacks, Congress authorized the use of military force against Al-Qaeda and its allies. Since then, America has consistently used this authorization as permission to repeatedly intervene militarily in the Middle East with drone assassinations and other interventions that are only remotely related to the original 2000 terrorism attack. Any military intervention abroad should be decided on its own merits, not on the basis of an event that happened 2 decades ago and has now largely been superseded. Number 3, I think what we need to do is release the Senate torture report. In 2014, the US Senate prepared a report on American use of torture in the war on terror, but released only a general summary. The details of the report, including the names of the persons who authorized and carried out the torture, have been suppressed. Torture is, of course, illegal. The full report needs to be released so that those who use torture can be identified and prosecuted. Only by holding torturers accountable now can we create precedent and pressure and a culture to prevent torture in the future. Number 4, we need to close Guantanamo Bay Prison. Soon after 9/11, the US opened a prison at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for suspected terrorists. It was designed as a place in which no law applied, where prisoners would be completely at the mercy of their interrogators and their torturers. Eventually, the Supreme Court established that some laws applied, Eventually, approximately 80% of the prisoners sent to Guantanamo were determined to be completely innocent and were released. At present, only about 40 prisoners remain at Guantanamo, and approximately half have been cleared for release, but have no place that will accept them. Only around 20 prisoners remain to be tried, with makeshift military commission form of prosecution that denies basic due process. Guantanamo could easily be closed, and the prisoners could easily be transferred to the federal criminal justice system and tried there with appropriate due process or released. All that is required is the political will to do it. But Guantanamo is a bleeding sore of injustice. It symbolizes all of America's worst criminal justice abuses: disregard for the rule of law, torture, indefinite incarceration without trial. It needs to be closed as soon as possible. Number 5, end discriminatory surveillance of Muslims and their neighborhoods. After 2 decades, intensive surveillance of Muslim communities has failed to identify any significant terrorist threats. Ironically, what the surveillance has shown is that Islamic communities are remarkably law-abiding, peaceful communities. Discriminatory surveillance of Muslim communities without a basis to believe that any crimes are being committed is illegal, and it should be stopped. And finally, we need to end the preemptive prosecution of innocent Muslims for crimes that they have not committed, and ideological prosecutions. My colleague, Kathy Manley, will describe in greater detail our efforts to end this abuse of the criminal justice system. I just wanted to describe for you here a few of several famous cases of preemptive prosecution so that you can appreciate how unjust these prosecutions are. The first one, of course, is my dear friend, Dr. Sami Al-Arian. In 2003, Dr. Sami, a distinguished professor at the University of South Florida, was arrested and charged essentially with providing material support for terrorism to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a designated terrorist organization. He was held in solitary confinement under inhumane conditions for 41 months prior to trial. The trial in Florida featured a heavy Zionist Israeli influence. After a 6-month trial and thousands of documents put into evidence, the jury failed to convict Dr. Sami on any of the major charges and deadlocked on some minor charges. Dr. Sami, however, was kept in jail pending a retrial of the minor charges. Realizing that the government would never leave him alone with such intense Zionist pressure against him, Dr. Sami agreed to plead guilty to 1 nonviolent count and be deported, providing he did not have to cooperate with the prosecution in the future. This was agreed. Then the Justice Department broke its word. A prosecutor in Virginia summoned Dr. Sami before a grand jury in Virginia to testify about all the matters for which he'd been found not guilty in Florida. It was clear that the prosecutor intended to charge Dr. Sami with perjury after his testimony. Dr. Sami could not refuse to testify because he had already been found not guilty once. Since he could not be retried on these same issues a second time, he could not refuse to testify before the grand jury on the grounds that his testimony might incriminate him. It was called an unfair perjury trap, in which the defendant will be charged no matter how he testifies. So instead, Dr. Sami refused to testify before the grand jury, claiming that under his agreement with the Florida prosecutors, he did not have to cooperate with the prosecutor in Virginia. And so in 2008, he was indicted for refusing to testify. This indictment, this perjury trap, was so unfair that the trial judge amazingly decided not to proceed with the trial and instead put Dr. Sami under house arrest in his daughter Layla's apartment in Washington. He lived under house arrest for another 5 years with no trial even scheduled, until the government finally gave up and deported him to Turkey. It was America's great loss and Turkey's great gain. But this is exactly how preemptive prosecution works. The government decides that for some reason they don't like you and you have to be incarcerated. And then it tries to find some reason to lock you up. If the first attempt doesn't succeed, they keep bringing new charges, new pretexts, until finally the government is able to get a conviction. And Sami's case is amazing in many respects because he was actually not guilty. He was not convicted of anything. He's one of the few people that was able to beat the government. Sami was held in prison under house arrest for some 10 years without ever having been convicted by a court or a jury. But in the middle of his ordeal, Dr. Sami showed his real character by inviting us all down to Layla's apartment to form a new civil rights organization, CCF, to fight against this kind of Islamophobia. He became my mentor in the struggle for civil freedoms and an inspiration for courageously standing up to injustice. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude. The other case I wanted to highlight right here was the case of Afia Siddiqui. Afia Siddiqui's case has been much discussed in Turkey. Dr. Afia was a brilliant Pakistani scientist who graduated from MIT in Boston and was awarded a PhD from Brandeis University. She married in the US, had 3 young children, and then divorced her husband and returned to Pakistan in 2003. A few months after returning to Pakistan, Afia and her 3 young children were kidnapped off the streets of Karachi by Pakistani Security Services, ISI, and then apparently turned over to American forces. The family simply disappeared and the whole disappearance was hushed up. We believe that she was sent to 1 or more black sites and tortured there. 5 years later, in 2008, Afia appeared mysteriously, drugged and disheveled in Ghazni, Afghanistan. She was detained by Ghazni police who notified the Americans that they had found Afia. A group of American soldiers were dispatched to interview Afia the next day. When the soldiers entered the room where Afia was being held, Afia looked out from behind a yellow curtain. One of the soldiers then shot her twice in the stomach, almost killing her. Then, without any authority, Afia was taken by the Americans to New York City and put on trial for attempted murder of the very soldiers who shot and almost killed her. At Afia's trial, 6 soldiers testified that Afia picked up a loaded gun that one of the soldiers had carelessly put aside and shot twice at the Americans who were standing against a wall on the other side of the room. The prosecution pointed to 2 holes in the wall and claimed that these were the bullet holes made when Afia missed. A complete FBI examination, a forensic examination of the crime scene, indicated that Afia's prints were not on the gun, no powder residue was found on the yellow curtain, no shell casings from the gun were found, no other bullet holes appeared anywhere else in the room. Then, at the end of the trial, a photograph was discovered taken before the American soldiers had arrived, showing that the 2 bullet holes were already present in the room. Afia could not have made the so-called bullet holes. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that she'd shot a gun, and it was overwhelming forensic proof. The only evidence was from the soldiers who obviously lied. Nonetheless, she was convicted and sentenced to 86 years in jail, an incredible sentence for someone in which no one was injured except for herself. Afia and her children were the victims of a disappearance, and by treaty, they were entitled to protection and assistance by the nations involved. Instead, Afia was convicted on phony criminal charges, and information about her case was classified and withheld from her. This case is a good example of how preemptive prosecution is used to cover up crimes by America and other governments. These are only 2 examples of how preemptive prosecution unfairly distorts the law into weapons of war and is used to control its domestic Muslim population. My colleague Kathy Manley will now discuss this subject in more detail and the writing of our report on manufacturing terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Downs. Very interesting. Thank you for highlighting those 2 cases. There's many to choose from, and so narrowing it down is certainly not easy. As you mentioned, your colleague Kathy Manley, she's also a defense attorney. She is one of the attorneys who also defended the imam in Albany, New York, Yasin Arif. She's one of the founding members of Project Salam and also co-authored the report Inventing Terrorists. She currently is the legal director for the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, and she's very busy in this capacity, as well as working with the chapter of New York Civil Liberties Union. Kathy, the floor is yours. Please utilize your 20 minutes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's hard to believe that it's been 20 years since 9/11. While Islamophobia in the US didn't start then, it certainly went into overdrive then. And I naively thought that by now there would be apologies and perhaps reparations for what it did to the Muslim community in the US. But I sorely underestimated the level of paranoia, Islamophobia, and sheer hatred in this country, unfortunately. As Steve Downs said, we got involved in this struggle with the arrest and prosecution of Yasin Arif in Albany, New York. He was arrested in 2004 and convicted in 2006. And when we realized that he was completely innocent, and yet with everything we did and the other attorneys in the case did, we were unable to prevent his conviction, we realized there was something really unfair going on, and we started looking into other cases. And then we formed Project Salam and eventually became founding members of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms in 2010. So our report, as Steve said, was first published in 2014, called Inventing Terrorists. And the way we approached it, we had realized, as Steve said, that what was happening was preemptive prosecution. And it's sort of based on a statement that former Vice President Dick Cheney said about preemptive war, but it applies the same way because they're looking at these cases as part of a war. He said if there's a 1% chance that this person might someday in the future attack us, we have to preempt it and go after them now. And that's exactly how they approached the Muslim community and started trying to preemptively prosecute many of them and put them away or deport them just in case that someday in the future they might have done something. So we looked at, the way we did it is the Department of Justice came up with a list of 608 cases that they called terrorist convictions in the United States. And they were almost all pretty 99% Muslim. And that was between the years of 2001 and 2015. And, you know, when you look at Guantanamo, as Steve was talking about, it's easy to see the unfairness there because they're not even charged mostly. They're just indefinitely detained and most of them are innocent. But when you look at prosecutions in this country, there's this idea that we have this fair criminal justice system. But when we studied these cases, we saw, and as we had seen in Yasin Arif's case, it's not fair at all. They have certain tools where they can prosecute and convict innocent people. And we discovered that out of those 608 cases that they called terrorists, 70% were what we call pure preemptive prosecution. There was no real crime committed. There was only manufactured crime, and I'll talk about how they do that. And then another 23% are what we call elements of preemptive prosecution, where there may have been some usually low-level crime going on, maybe a drug crime or some kind of fraud, but because the targets were Muslim and the government was suspicious of them, they were treated more harshly and they were kind of treated as terrorists, even though they weren't charged with terrorism. So between those two categories, that's 93% of those cases were preemptively prosecuted. And actually there were, out of those 608 cases, there were only about 15 actual cases of attacks, violent attacks, or even attempted violent attacks within the United States. Even though people might assume if they hear that there's 608 convicted terrorists that was what was going on with all of them, but no, pretty much none of them. So how did the government do this? I'll talk about 4 or 5 different mechanisms they use, and there's others too, but I'll focus on these 4. So one is sting operations. So many of the cases were, as in Yasin's case, where the government decided to send an informant in and try to manipulate the target into saying something on a recording, to saying that they would agree to an attack. And in some of the cases, that never even happened. It didn't happen in Yasin Arif's case. He never agreed to anything. In fact, he made it pretty clear that he was opposed to it, but they still managed to convict him. But in many of the cases, they target young, vulnerable people, often with mental illness, who are vulnerable to these manipulations by the informant. Sometimes they offer large amounts of money, such as in the case of the Newburgh 4, where the main target was offered $250,000 if he would agree to work with this informant in some kind of attack, where the informant came up with every bit of what was supposed to happen. The targets didn't even know how to find a map on Google Maps. They didn't have driver's licenses. They didn't know how to do any of the things that they were being asked to do. So the FBI and the informant had to do everything, come up with the entire plan, and then get them to agree to it. And that was one of the most egregious cases. But there's many, many cases that are very unfair. The Fort Dix 5 case that we're involved with now on an appeal was, I'll just talk about 3 of the defendants very briefly. The 3 Duca brothers, they were roofers from a working class background of Albanian descent, Muslims, and they were targeted in this sting operation. I don't even know why they were targeted, but they never agreed to any attack. The plan was that they were supposed to agree to attack Fort Dix in New Jersey. And one of the other co-defendants did kind of agree to that, and he was manipulated and treated very unfairly as well. He was very vulnerable to this manipulation. But the 3 Duca brothers never even knew that Fort Dix was the target of this supposed plan. So they just talked kind of very vaguely, oh, maybe somebody should do something someday, but we're not really going to do it, they said. And yet somehow they were convicted. The prosecution had to change the theory during the trial from this is a conspiracy to attack Fort Dix to this is a conspiracy to attack unknown people at an unknown time in an unknown place, perhaps overseas. So that was what they got convicted of. And the 3 Duca brothers were sentenced to life in prison for this. It sounds unbelievable, but and have been unable to get anywhere with their appeals. And I don't think we're going to get too far with these appeals either, unfortunately, because it's so hard once you're convicted and once you lose your direct appeal. Anyway, so there's many, many abuses that are sting operations. And then another, and these are overlapping tools that the government uses too. So they use many of these tools in the same case. So another one is the material support to terrorism law. And that is something that started in the 1990s, but what happens is the US State Department can designate an organization, any organization that uses violence. So, there's some that use violence that they like, they use violence themselves, all these governments use violence, but they can pick organizations that they don't like and call them terrorist organizations and officially designate them as foreign terrorist organizations. And then if someone does anything in any way to so-called help support this group, so it could be writing a letter to the editor saying that I think this is unfair, they shouldn't be listed as a terrorist organization. It could be working with the group to say maybe you should work through the UN to try to peacefully resolve your real complaints that you have instead of using violence. It could be just maybe being a lawyer for the group. Anything like that could be considered and has been considered material support to terrorism and can be prosecuted, and you can be sentenced to up to 20 years in prison for any one count of it. And so this has been used in many cases, and one of the most, well, probably the worst is, which you may have heard of, is the Holy Lamb Foundation case. And the Holy Lamb Foundation was the biggest Muslim charity in the United States, very well respected, was giving money and aid to many different communities around the world when they needed it. One of the places it was aiding was Gaza, and just giving money to help children, help construct schools, hospitals, nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with violence. There were not even any allegations that it had anything to do with violence, what their aid was for. And yet, because Hamas was obviously involved in Gaza and later became the elected government of Gaza, the US government said that by giving this money to these clinics and hospitals and schools and everything through the Sakat committees, that somehow that was intertwined with Hamas, and therefore they were guilty of material support to terrorism because Hamas was a designated terrorist organization. The first trial was a mistrial, and they were retried and convicted and sentenced to 65 years. The leaders of it were sentenced to 65 years in prison, which is a life sentence for them. And these are some of the finest people you'll ever meet. Really amazing, wonderful people. And it's a tragedy. And there's many other abuses using the material support laws, because once they are able to connect you in some way to one of these organizations, it's so easy for them to count anything as support to it. So actually it's weird because recently there was this more right-wing group called the Boogaloo Boys. I don't know if you've heard of it. I don't want to get into all of that, but the point is that the government did a sting operation where they sent an informant into these Boogaloo Boys group, and the informant was claiming to be connected to Hamas. And the only reason they did that was to say, now we can get a foreign terrorist organization in here and it'll be easier to charge these guys. Boogaloo Boys obviously have nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas wants nothing to do with them. But they said, oh, sure, if Hamas wants to help us, sure. And then they can get a material support charge against them. So I think that as part of the changes that Steve was mentioning that need to happen, we should probably repeal the material support law. But I'm gonna, let's see, we have a couple of more tools that the government used that I want to talk about. Another one that's used in many federal criminal cases, not just these cases, is conspiracy laws. The government can charge someone with conspiracy when they have very little to do with what other people might be doing. And it's basically guilt by association. So we have some people who might know other people, and then they might travel or say things on their Facebook, even though they're not really involved in any plot. This conspiracy laws allows them to be roped in with other people who might be planning something or even talking about something. And so, for example, the case of Ziad Yagi, there was the Boyd family was talking about maybe doing attacks. It was very vague. And they knew Ziad Yagi and helped him travel to Jordan. And even though, because he's Palestinian, so he was traveling for family reasons, but they were able to connect that to what the Boyds were talking about and convict Ziad of conspiracy, this very vague conspiracy, and sentence him to 20-something years in prison, maybe 30 years. I can't remember all the sentences in these cases because there's so many cases. So classified, so sting operations, material support, conspiracy laws. Also, the use of classified evidence is used very unfairly because, for example, in Yassin Araf's case, there was false classified evidence claiming that he was a member of Al-Qaeda named Mohammed Yassin, and we never knew that they were alleging this. We could have shown it was false because Mohammed Yassin is clearly a different person. He's missing 3 of his fingers, and then he was killed in 2010. So it was like really clear that this is not Yassin, but we didn't even find out that the government was alleging this to the judge until a FOIA request in 2011 after the guy was killed, the guy that they said he was originally. So the way it works is under the Classified Information Procedures Act, the prosecutor can file under this and give classified information to the judge, and the defense never gets to see it unless it's considered favorable to the defense. So if you're the judge is looking at this stuff saying, oh my God, this is an Al-Qaeda terrorist. Of course, that's not favorable to the defense, so I'm not going to tell them about it. But, you know, under the 6th Amendment here in the US Constitution, we're supposed to be able to confront the evidence against us. And this SIPA by not allowing you to challenge this kind of evidence, it completely violates the Sixth Amendment, and yet it's been upheld in court so far. So even though the lead trial attorney in Yasin's case and in other cases got a security clearance just to see the classified evidence that was being given to the judge, he didn't get to see it because the judge said it's not favorable, so you don't get to see it. So that's completely unfair, and actually was very shocking to me and still is. And the last thing I'll mention as a tool that the government uses, and there are others too, but in the interest of time, I'll focus on those, is the way these cases are sentenced. Now, the US federal criminal system and sentencing in the US anyway is super, super harsh, harsher than almost anywhere else in the world. And with these cases, it's 3 times more harsh because there's something called the terrorism sentencing enhancement, where it basically, if they find that it applies, and that's a very unfair process too, then they basically can sentence you to 3 times the sentence you would normally get if it wasn't for this enhancement. So you have a lot of people who get life sentences in these cases, such as the Duca brothers, such as Afia Siddiqui, 86 years, such as the Holy Land Foundation, and many more, many more. So I don't know how much time I have, but I'll just talk about, I think.
About 5 minutes, Kathy.
Okay, 5 minutes. So I'll talk about the bill that we drafted called the Ego Relief Act, Entrapment and Governmental Overreach Act. And it's really what should be a no-brainer. I would like to actually go beyond that, what we have in there, because I think there needs to be more reform, but this is just something that I thought would be fairly simple and straightforward, that would, if it could get through Congress, that would remedy a lot of these abuses, not all of them, but a lot of them. And it would be retroactive, so we could go back and reopen the cases where these people are still sitting in prison. So it has 3 aspects to it. And the first is to create an entrapment defense to deal with these sting operations, because right now there basically is no entrapment defense. There's supposed to be, but the way the case law has developed, it doesn't apply to anything anymore. So you can have in the Newberg case where somebody was offered $250,000, and then he said, I don't want to do this. He refused to talk to the informant. The informant came back to him and said, what, you don't want $250,000? And he said, oh, okay, I'll do it. That's kind of the definition of entrapment, what it should be. And yet that doesn't apply as entrapment the way the law works now, because they say if you don't back out of the plot, then you have what's called a ready response to the inducement, and therefore it's not entrapment, you're not entrapped. So basically there is no entrapment defense now. So what the EGO bill would be to say that unless you're taking substantial steps to already engage in this attack before the informant comes and starts manipulating you, you can't be prosecuted, you can't be convicted of this. So that's the kind of most substantial part of the bill, because it would actually create a defense in the law where there doesn't exist one now. The next part would be to reform the material support law. Now, I'd like to see it repealed entirely. I think it's ridiculous that they get to pick any group and decide that it's a terrorist group. But this bill would just say you have to have an intent to support a violent attack in order to be convicted of material support to terrorism. You can't just be trying to give money to kids in Gaza and when it's nothing to do with violence. And, so that would fix some of these, would maybe get some people out of prison and keep them from going after some people when they don't have the intent to support violence. And then the third part of the EGO bill is just this dealing with the classified evidence. It's saying that, and it should be a total no-brainer, it's saying that if the defense attorney can get a security clearance, and I don't know if I could, but you can always get someone on your team that has one. And then if the judge is getting classified evidence, that has to be given to the defense attorney with security clearance, regardless of whether the judge thinks the evidence is favorable or not, because you have to be able to show its faults or, challenge it in some way. So those are the 3 parts of the EGO bill. And Steve has been valiantly trying to get Congress interested in it. And they have expressed, when he's met with people, they have all said, oh yeah, this makes sense, but well, maybe when you get a sponsor, we'll support it, but nobody's been willing to sponsor it yet. So we need somebody to sponsor it. We need some sponsors for it, or we need to work with other groups and have it be part of a larger criminal justice reform package. So we're hoping that we can get somewhere with that. And I'll leave it at there for now.
Oh my, that was depressing, Kathy.
Yeah.
But this is reality. If we have time at the end of today, I can share some brief stories as well. I have some experience prosecuting and breaking up actual terrorists in my capacity as a in-house lawyer in the finance industry, where I broke up a terror cell, real terrorists that took $35 million and sent it to Al-Qaeda. And as late as 2016, I was a member of the Intelligence Community Lawyers and Law and National Security Standing Committee in the United States. When the Senate torture report was released, I was sitting next to former CIA director, Michael Hayden, and I helped him escape the media from the University Club in Washington, D.C. to a van. His assistant told the media mistakenly where he was, and he was not very happy about it. And we have some conversations in the intelligence community about material support and how broadly it's written. It's definitely worth more conversations. I'm also familiar with the Boogaloo Boys case where the FBI claimed to be Hamas. Remind me, Kathy, what state was that? Was it Minnesota or Michigan? I think it was Minnesota. The recent one where they claimed to be a member of Hamas that would provide bombing supplies to the Boogaloo Boys. This was Minnesota.
I think it might have been Michigan. I think it was Michigan.
Michigan, okay. Yeah, that one surprised me. I thought Hamas would be very surprised as well to be collaborating with the Boogaloo Boys. Our next speaker, Asim Qureshi, who's making a lot of progress on similar issues in the United Kingdom. Asim is also an attorney. He has specialized in international law and Islamic law. He has completed a PhD in international conflict analysis from the University of Kent. He's currently research director at an advocacy group called CAGE, which since 2003 has specialized in investigating the impact of counterterrorism practices worldwide. He's written and published extensively on this issue, and since 2010, he has been advising legal teams involved in defending terrorism trials in the US and at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I anticipate some Guantanamo questions for you at the end of today, Asim, so be ready for that. The floor is yours, 20 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Ubaid. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon or good morning or even indeed good evening to you wherever you are in the world at the moment. My sincere thanks to Dr. Sami and the whole team at CIGA for putting this event together and giving us this opportunity to speak about some difficult issues. And let's be honest, I think this is one of the hardest parts of the global war on terror, this idea that we are constantly having to operate, those of us within the kind of human rights world are constantly having to operate under a different set of norms and laws than the vast majority of society is permitted to operate by. We are often representing people who are subject to a two-tier system of the law, and with that comes a certain unknowability on how we can best and most effectively represent our clients, and that is a huge reality. That not only do we have to deal with the inadequacy of laws that are clearly discriminatory, but we also have to deal with the human beings who are responsible for upholding those laws. And we have to deal with juries who are constantly fed a narrative of fear and discrimination, not just by policymakers, but by the media as well. And so the odds are stacked against you entirely from the very beginning. And, I have so much respect for the work of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, because, they've been really pioneering so much of this work that is so necessary for us all for so long. And, at CAGE, we've been trying to do very similar work to them. In fact, in many ways, I consider CCF to be a sister organization to us in so many ways. And so let's take this back, because what I want to do is really widen the scope of this discussion to understand the malignancy of policies within the global war on terror. When states insert policies that discriminate, they don't just remain static. It never remains just within that particular state itself. There is a certain best practice of securitization that travels across the world as states talk to one another, as they really try and learn from each other, and ultimately in the best way to repress their own populations. And the global war on terror provides that narrative arc for them to do that. And so, you really need to start with George W. Bush's announcements immediately in the aftermath of 9/11, using phrases like a crusade, talking about you're either with us or with the terrorists. These types of statements, they're not value neutral. We have to understand that when such statements are made by public officials, they provide then a narrative that is then picked up by others. So that's why even when Tony Blair later speaks of an arc of extremism, he's not just using these words without meaning. He's using them specifically in a way in order to insert within a public discourse a narrative about the problems that he sees in the world. So when George Bush was initially talking, it was about you're either with us or with the terrorists. So the word terrorism is now inserted as a binary moral issue. You're either one side or the other. And then as the years go by, you see the word terrorism being used less and less. And instead, you start seeing the insertion of the word extremist. Okay. And this is done very willfully, very purposefully, because what the word extremism then does is that it takes terrorism as an act and it brings the word extremism in as an idea. And so now we're able to expand the scope of what can be problematized. We already knew with terrorism that it was already ideological, that they were going after people because of their beliefs, but what it still required was some kind of act. So, when we heard Kathy and Steve speak about the way in which plots have been manufactured, they still have to manufacture these plots in order to suggest that there is something kind of tangible at stake here. But when we move into the area of extremism, what we're now doing, what these states are now doing, is that they're saying ultimately, just by virtue of somebody believing in something, they're not only a threat now, but they could be a threat in an unknowable future. And that's really where I want to focus my presentation on, this idea of pre-crime, and which has now kind of developed its own science. And it's so fascinating when you think about kind of the popularity of movies like Minority Report, which was based on an essay by Philip K. Dick. The whole notion of pre-crime was considered to be laughable. It was considered to be something that was this stuff should exist in the realm of dystopian fiction, right? That's where it should remain. It should just be this kind of horrible fictional world that nobody should ever go near. Until, of course, you sit in a room with CVE or Prevent officials in the UK, and they say, well, we operate in the pre-criminal space, without any sense of irony whatsoever. They use this language. And so you see how the dystopia becomes real in front of your very eyes when these utterances are made in a completely non-ironic way, that they believe that that it's possible to do something called pre-crime. And this is important because you know, the global war on terror, as I said at the start, doesn't remain static. It's not just located in the space of Iraq or Afghanistan or in the mainland US or the mainland UK. Whatever is happening, it gets picked up elsewhere. And depending on the specific geopolitics that are going on within any specific region, the words terrorism and extremism are used in order to subvert any kind of political dissent. And that has huge implications for us all, because it becomes then increasingly difficult to say support the rights of others internationally when they are being framed through the lens of terrorism. We see this now regularly, particularly with Israel and India, who have sought to repress the self-determination of Palestinians and Kashmiris, specifically through the narrative of the war on terror. I remember many years ago meeting Yasser Arafat before he passed away, and you know, it was so fascinating to hear him speak about you know, how the war on terror has effectively been used against Palestinian resistance. And this was kind of very early on. This was in 2004. And so, you know, what is an issue of settler colonization, settler colonialism, has effectively been rebranded as something that's to do with terrorism, effectively the global war on terror, that these are things that are somehow connected with one another. Sorry, I don't know what's happened there. But yeah, sorry, I think I'll just, Ubayd, is everything okay with the?
Yes, everything is okay. It's just
right,
showing.
okay.
Yep, you're okay.
Okay, sure, no worries at all. Yeah, so there are two case studies that I want to focus on initially before we go into some of the theory around all of this. The first one is to do with Syria. So Syria is really fascinating for me because I had a number of friends that were living in Syria around the time of the 2003 invasion. We were speaking quite regularly with one another, and the invasion of Iraq, should I say. And I remember one of my friends literally in 1 week after the Friday prayer, expressing to me how the mosques were encouraging Syrians to travel to Iraq in order to defend Iraq from the impending US invasion. So this was the message that was being given on a public platform in the mosques. And they were saying that, you know, we're hearing this stuff ourselves, that there's a very clear narrative that's being expressed by the state through these imams, that you should go and you should fight and defend your Muslim brothers and sisters in Iraq against American aggression. So fascinating that, you know, literally within the next couple of weeks, the same conversation I'm having about the same thing, they're saying the exact opposite narrative is now taking place. That when people had left, they'd opened the borders, they were allowing people to leave, that once they had left, now the imams were saying that actually it's a crime, it's haram for anybody to even think about going over there, and that anybody who's gone over there is a terrorist, is an extremist. So how these moments geopolitically were used by the state in order to perhaps get rid of people that they didn't want to be in their own country, right? For whatever reasons, you know, almost impossible to say exactly what those reasons were exactly, but the Syrian government had chosen to use that moment in a specific way as part of a narrative of the global war on terror. That now they had shifted their narrative to, no, these are extremists, these are terrorists, we should never allow them back in. And of course, one of the things that people often forget in relation to Syria is how complicit they were in the torture and the rendition of a number of men, including Maher Arar, Muayyid Nuruddin, Abdullah al-Malki, and many others, that they were effectively doing the dirty work of the Americans by torturing them, by interrogating them, by taking information. I represented two people myself from the UK who were having questions sent to them directly. Like the Syrian interrogators were giving information about their lives to them that could only have ever come from sources in the UK, right? So this idea of, you know, you've got John Bolton saying Syria is part of the axis of evil, right? is a public declaration within the UN, but behind the scenes at exactly the same time, the security agencies of all these different countries are cooperating with one another in different ways. So the war on terror is far more complicated than these ideas, at a state level of just good and evil. They present themselves in many more difficult ways, ones that complicate our ideas about the geopolitics of the world. And the other case study that I want to think about, help think through, is that of East Turkestan. So, the Uyghur issue, and how China has taken an issue of settler colonialism that's been going on for over 100 years, and rebranded it. And what's so fascinating about that in my work is that it's really Guantanamo Bay that starts that process. You have Uyghur Muslims who are picked up from Afghanistan and Pakistan, sent to Guantanamo Bay. And this is the perfect moment for the Americans and the Chinese to cooperate with one another, to say, okay, China, we want you to rebrand these guys as terrorists. And what we'll do is that we will recognize that you have an issue of terrorism that you have been dealing with within China. There's a really great book by Sean Roberts called The War on the Uyghur, which really goes through this history very, very well, especially in relation to the way in which China and their repression of the Uyghur was normalized by America at a policy level. So that's why, like, some of these acts that we see right now, and these statements that we see coming out of America in relation to the Uyghur, they seem very, very disingenuous, considering especially the first 15 years of the global war on terror and the way in which China was given a free hand to almost rebrand their repression in whatever way that they wanted. It's important for us to be aware of that, and not simply just accept the fact that America has made some good announcements or pronouncements on what is taking place to the Uyghur. They have been complicit in their repression, particularly within that first 10 to 15 years. So we come to this moment now in East Turkestan, where what is the language that's being used by the Chinese state? They're using the language of not only terrorism, but of extremism, of radicalization, and most importantly, de-radicalization. That is how they reframe the entire issue, that we have extremists in our midst. And therefore, what we're doing, we're going to carry out a cultural genocide, but we're going to do it through the narrative of the global war on terror. We're helping them, we're de-radicalizing them. We're making sure that we have a safe society for all of us, right? But they're doing it at a level and to an extent that has been completely unprecedented, which is perhaps where it seems so particularly egregious compared to other parts of the world, where there, of course, hasn't been that same degree of numbers, let's put it simply. But China didn't invent this narrative. It co-opted the narrative. It took the narrative from who? Really, let's be honest, from the British, who were the leaders in many ways of the whole prevent and CBE narrative. So these ideas around radicalization and de-radicalization that China is using, the progenitors of that really were the British. And so we have to understand then where does this all come from? What were the British trying to do, and how was it so easy for other states to co-opt that language? And so now in the next part, that's really what I'm going to focus on. And it's so interesting that even in the courts, we have Justice Hayden, who in one of our cases to do with extremism said, those words are sadly now so much a part of contemporary life, extremism and radicalization, that they scarcely need definition. You see, that's the thing about the global war on terror, that everyone is an expert, that actually, in some ways, these ideas are beyond science. They're beyond study, because we are told this narrative that we can simply just, using our gut feeling, know what these things are, rather than having a more complex understanding of where political violence comes from, what are all the different sociological factors that are at play, what are the different psychological factors that are at play that allow for these moments to take place. But rather what we do, and what our states do, is that they reduce all issues to pathologies because they want to be able to predict any future acts. And so they have to reduce communities, they have to reduce ideas, they have to reduce beliefs to very simplistic narratives in order to make a threat knowable. You see, it's too difficult to just simply leave it out there and say the world is a complex place, and we sometimes just have to deal with the world as we have contributed to make it, right? That's a much more difficult narrative than simply saying, well, if you've read Sayyid Qutb's milestones, then you're within a kind of a nebulous cloud of extremism, right? That's so much easier for them to do, rather than actually reaching for any real science around this. And the science is important because that is how the British government has attempted to provide cover to itself in terms of how it approaches, you know, those within this so-called pre-crime space. So what they did is that they produced something called the Extremism Risk Guidance 22 plus. And what was so telling about this is when we at CAGE, when we went looking for the government's kind of science of radicalization, it was the number 22 that really gave up the game to us, because it wasn't like they said, oh, there's about 20 factors or there's 30 factors, right? The number was 22. And we're like, that's just too specific not to be based on some kind of study. And so we went looking for this study. And actually what we found as we approach all public bodies in relation to it is that they all said the same thing, which is this is a matter of national security, this document. We cannot share it with you. And so eventually we managed to track down, actually, I must say, purely by luck more than anything else, that the authors of that study had written a methodology paper that they got published in the US, not in the UK, in a US academic journal, in a very, very niche journal. But somehow we managed to find this. And in that, they talked about their methodology for the study. And it's such a fascinating document because what they admit to is so telling. So for example, they say in our study, we couldn't actually find enough violent offenders. So we based our predictive models on non-violent offenders too. So your entire modeling system is to try and predict future violence, but you couldn't find enough violent offenders to partake in your study. And so you go to people who weren't violent to begin with. It, you know, just like these little moments that you see, even when they say, well, actually, our science, you can't really use it to predict with any certainty. They also say at another point that, well, we know that foreign policy is a major factor, but we didn't really include it in our study in this case. So the kind of admissions that they were willing to give within this paper were really fascinating. It doesn't unfortunately contain any of the data, which is obviously what I was extremely interested in looking at. But ultimately, what it came down to is this, that they decided that they wanted to pathologize certain aspects of behavior. So they said, well, hey, look, there are these 22 factors that we think teachers, doctors, dentists, nurses, kindergarten teachers should be on the lookout for in order to predict somebody who's on a pathway to radicalization. What did these factors include? They included things like, and this is explicitly stated, having a desire for moral or political change, being at a transient phase of life, you know, kind of being depressed. Okay, these were all the factors that were given. I'm laughing, but it's so horrible when you actually start to think about it. But what is even more horrible is that in 2015, the government placed these factors on a statutory level, which means that every single public sector worker in the UK is by law required to use these factors in determining whether or not a student or a pupil or a patient is on a pathway to radicalization. And we've heard so many cases of doctors asking their patients about what they think of ISIS, for example, when they've gone in to have their leg checked because it's been injured. And so many cases like that, it's almost impossible. You might want to check out the work of Cage on this, but also the organization Prevent Watch. And why this is important is because, and Kathy and Steve will know this better than I do, within death penalty work in the US, you had a predictive psychological tool that was called future dangerousness that was used for many decades, which was used as a tool in order to predict whether or not somebody who was facing the death penalty might be a recidivist if they were released. When after decades of using this to predict whether or not somebody was dangerous, and hundreds of people had been executed on the basis of this science, when they finally did an analysis of this, they said it was as accurate as pointing to somebody in the street and saying, I think this person might be violent in the future. That was the degree of accuracy that it had. And hundreds of people were executed in the US based on this flawed science. And the science is no different than what is being used in this ERG 22+. And why this is important further is because this is being exported globally. When an American journalist, Vikas Mirza, he had read our report on this, our expose on the use of this ERG 22+, and so he wanted to do some further follow-up work. He emailed the Home Office, the UK Home Office, and asked them for the study. The Home Office, in the Freedom of Information request, the response was, we cannot share it with you because of its commercial value. So it tells you a lot about how the UK was exporting this science and how they saw it as having a value beyond simply what was taking place in the UK, that they wanted to export this internationally. Sorry, Ubaid, you'll have to let me know how much time I have left. I'm afraid I forgot to take a note of the time.
It's okay. You've gone over. It's been entertaining. You gave me the $1 billion idea that we notify Zoom that we can click a button and everybody is simultaneously unmuted so that we can hear the laughter. This is one thing I miss with Zoom conferences. It used to be you could sit in a room and when you hear such crazy things as the pseudoscience, you can see and hear the room laughing. And if people could hear this, it reminds me of what the Soviet Union did to trick the United States in the 60s. They would come up with these fake ideas to see if the US would replicate it. They started a rumor that they had psychics who could prevent war. They spread the rumor that they were teaching animals English, and that one the US tried to replicate. They spent millions of dollars converting a house to a aquarium lab, and they tried to teach a dolphin named Peter English. It went horribly wrong. It became sexual between the experiments, and ultimately Peter the dolphin committed suicide. And Russia was celebrating this because they got the US to imitate it. What you talked about with Philip K. Dick, this is exactly what he would focus on, is some of these pseudosciences of predictive crimes, having dreams, and turning this into policy. It's truly shocking that pseudoscience now, as you said, it's become adopted at a statutory level. And the problem with the pseudoscience is if you don't have data to support it, because it's a pseudoscience, now everybody is an expert. You don't need data to support it. You can be an expert. I can be an expert. Maybe I had a dream of who's going to commit crimes tomorrow based on 23 factors. I'm an expert now. This is absolutely insane. Let's go head to our next speaker. Awesome, very, very enlightening. We need to have a full week on that topic. And until then, resume your life in the UK. If you see it, say it, sort it. If you see anything strange as this conference continues, you're in your home. See it, say it, sort it. Our next speaker is very involved on countering violent extremism, the CVE programs in the United States. Paula Thompson, she's very focused on the war on terror, Islam, countering violent extremism, and an emphasis on decolonial studies, which is something that has momentum right now. She has served as Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the University of California-Berkeley for 7 years, and she is currently Director of Research. She's written many reports, first of its kind reports on Islamophobia in India, stoking bigotry, and she's currently working on Islamophobia in the video game industry. Very interesting. She has studied interdisciplinary studies from the University of California-Berkeley. She has a master's in Islamic studies from Berkeley as well, and she's a doctoral student in cultural and historical studies of religion with a focus on Islamic studies. Paula, you might be too academically qualified to be a pseudoscience advisor to the British government, but we can certainly try. The choice is yours. What do you think, Paula?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Al-Arian, for this opportunity, and thank you to my co-panelists for your decades worth of groundbreaking work and your bravery. And also a special thanks to the people on the ground who made this timely and important conference come to fruition. So today I will be speaking about what UK academic David Miller has referred to as Zionist Islamophobia, which contributes to subversive panics regarding the threat of Islam and Muslims, which in turn drives securitization. As Jocelyn Cesari aptly points out, securitization is not simply a state of prevention of foreign political violence. It is also increasingly aimed at Islamic practices like the burqa, which are interpreted as signs of political radicalism. One of the expected consequences of such a situation has been to grant governments greater means to control religions in general. Furthermore, securitization of Islam and Muslims includes entities beyond the state, such as political actors and Zionist advocates that grant the securitization of Islam greater legitimacy and urgency. That includes organizations that pose as Jewish interfaith partners that attempt to penetrate the Muslim communities, cause divisiveness, and push for the normalization of Israel. A quote in Life During Wartime, Resisting Counterinsurgency, edited by Christian Williams et al., captures the essence of my presentation thusly. Subversive panics and right-wing witch hunts rely on counter-subversion experts who tell scare stories often built around pre-existing ethnic, racial, political, and religious bigotry. Not only do such experts drive panic, but they are also active participants in the lucrative countering violent extremism industry, as I will show. To begin, one second, please, I need some water. Several grandfather Zionist Jewish organizations that function today as nonprofits in the United States facilitated the creation of Israel and continue to sustain the state today. Throughout the Cold War, some Zionist nonprofits functioned as a private police force, at times conducting investigations in extensive secret campaigns, turning data over to the FBI for follow-up. Staff members of Pro-Israel Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, and the American Jewish Committee, AJC, also provided information to the House on Un-American Activities Committee, a committee that investigated alleged disloyalty and subversive activities during the Cold War. At the same time, the ADL was supplied with information by law enforcement agencies across the country, including the FBI, the US Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and local police departments. This reciprocal relationship with non-state actors and Zionist nonprofits can be understood as part of the extensive network to uncover, regulate, disrupt political dissent, often at the expense of civil liberties. In 1972, a US State Department program dubbed Operation Boulder, reminiscent of today's racist war on terror programs, to counter extremism and terrorism, was enacted by a US presidential directive for the purpose of keeping America safe from any Arab or others of a suspicious nature. following the hostage taking and killing of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, Germany. Targeting Arabs, Arab Americans, and other political and non-political associations, Operation Boulder coordinated between international and domestic agencies of surveillance, including the State Department, CIA, FBI, Immigration Bureau activities, and European and Israeli intelligence sources. Operation Boulder has also been referred to and functioned as a dragnet and a US government campaign of harassment, intimidation, and deportation against Arab Americans and Arabs living in this country from any kind of political and associational activity that relates to Palestine or the Palestine-Israel question, and all political activity of anti-Zionist character. Additionally, it attempted to create a wedge of resentment between the Arab American community and political activists of that community, along with the creation of a network of informers. Furthermore, Operation Boulder reinforced the link between Arabs and terrorism, fostered by the media, and especially by Israel and pro-Israeli propaganda. Joe Stork and Renee Thieberge point to the anti-Arab racism deployed during the operation by Zionist groups, the Israeli government, and the US government through statements reinforcing Arabs as terrorists, extremists, and inherently violent. Similar to the post-September 11, 2001 climate in America, Operation Boulder also made it risky to affiliate or make financial contributions with and to groups that may later be labeled as terrorist organizations. Toward the end of the Cold War, historian and civil liberties attorney Frank Donner warned that the anti-communist witch hunt was shifting to counter-subversives such as the terrorist as scapegoat. He also claimed that terms such as Wahhabi, Salafi, and Muslim Brotherhood would supplant the communist as the new boogeyman in rerouted Cold War conspiracy theories. It should also be noted that the government of Israel and Zionist groups are going to great lengths to connect pro-Palestine and pro-BDS individuals, groups, and activities to terrorism. Thus, Islam is pointed to not only as the source or ideology of terrorism, but also anti-Semitism. Claims of Muslim anti-Semitism are being circulated by Zionist individuals and organizations and advocated in the US and abroad to silence support for Palestine and BDS and to further securitize Muslims and the Islamic faith. For example, both the aforementioned nonprofits, the AJC and the ADL, have Muslim or Islamic anti-Semitism publications. In 2002, following on the heels of September 11, 2001, the ADL released an Islamic anti-Semitism in historical perspective that traces what they refer to as the roots of anti-Jewish sentiment in classic Muslim theology. This report takes as a given the existence of widespread anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East based on Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, historical doctrinal relations with Jews, including what is claimed to be humiliations and their dhimmi status. Such is a similar discourse to that of polemicist Bat Yor, aka Giselle Littman, a well-known figure in the Islamophobia industry, pushing the subversive panic of Eurabia, a far-right Islamophobic conspiracy theory of Islamization to Europe, and Dhimitude, also considered Western subjugation to Islam or the threat of a future subjugation to Islam. In fact, Bat Yor is also cited in the AJC's 2002 report titled Muslim Anti-Semitism, A Clear and Present Danger, which was intended as sounding the alarm bell for a clear and immediate threat to Jews worldwide, as well as democratic values across the Western Hemisphere. The report takes issue with what is referred to as the Quranic image of the Jew, and specifically points to the Holy Quran surahs, referring to Jews and children of Israel, for example, in Al-Baqarah and Al-Ma'idah, to name a few. The report claims that the notion that Jews are continuously hatching new plots and conspiracies to sow discord, conflict and division within the Muslim community is seen as self-evident and perfectly consistent with Quranic teaching. The report takes issue similar with Hadith as well. Pro-Israel nonprofit ADL is mining Islamic texts for what it refers to as anti-Semitic passages. In the report, Teaching Hate and Violence, Problematic Passages from Saudi State Textbooks for the 2018-2019 school year, the ADL acknowledges that passages with which it has contentions have their roots in religious teachings and include direct quotes from the Quran. That means that the ADL is attacking what Muslims regard as divine revelation and directly attributing anti-Jewish hate and tolerance to the most fundamental Muslim holy text. The ADL has also called for more tolerant quotes from other authoritative sources. Importantly, before I continue, the ADL and AJC both have roles in the United States in countering violent extremism programs that emerged in 2011 under the Obama administration, which was founded on the premise that one's faith basically determines their propensity towards violence. CVE has been described by the Brennan Center as a counterterrorism strategy that recruits community leaders, social workers, teachers, and public health providers ostensibly to assist the government in identifying individuals that may be at risk of becoming violent extremists, as we have heard from my colleague Asim today. In 2015, countering violent extremism and anti-Semitism converged. US House Resolution 354, titled Expressing the Sense of the House of Representatives regarding the safety and security of Jewish communities in Europe, was passed calling for the integration of efforts to counter violent extremism and efforts to counter anti-Semitism. And it proffered that the United States government work closely with European governments and their law enforcement agencies. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the OSCE, the European Union, Europol, and Interpol, to formally recognize, partner, train, and share information with Jewish community security groups and partnership training and information sharing in general. That same year in 2015, were calls for integration of efforts to counter violent extremism and anti-Semitism protecting Jews. Countering violent extremism pilot programs were implemented in Los Angeles, Boston, and Minneapolis that stigmatized Muslims, reinforced Islamophobic stereotypes, facilitated covert intelligence gatherings, suppressed dissent against government policies, and sowed discord in targeted communities, according to the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University. The ADL was involved in the development of the CVE initiative in Boston and was a participant in CVE in Houston, even in the recent FOIA documents, both of which were Muslim community specific. In addition, the ADL runs the Center on Extremism, situated in the tech industry-rich Silicon Valley. In the past few years, the ADL has also been stockpiling orchestrators and leaders of Obama-era CVE, including George Salim, the first head of Countering Violent Extremism Office at the Department of Homeland Security and of the Federal CVE Task Force, and Jay Johnson and Michael Chertoff, former Department of Homeland Security secretaries. Under the guise of protecting individuals and the country from extremists, the ADL is once again tracking activity in the US and abroad, assisting law enforcement with countless investigations and helping to disrupt and prevent attacks. Additionally, the ADL claims to work with every major federal, state, local, and military law enforcement agency, and they provide counterterrorism training in Israel for American police departments. They also engage in CVE training and sharing of best practices with countries such as Pakistan, UAE, and other European countries. The AJC is also involved in countering violent extremism targeting Muslims. AJC's 22 US regional offices will assist Muflahun, a Muslim co-founded CVE organization, in training bystanders and gatekeepers to prevent violent extremism in their communities. They were granted $77,025 in funds from the US Department of Homeland Security under former President Trump's Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program, TVTP. The AJC Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, Belgium, plays an even larger role in the counter-violent extremism industry, driving narratives about the dangers of Muslims and Islam, as well as partnering with Islamophobic organizations. In 2019, the Department of Justice held a summit on combating anti-Semitism. The majority of the summit's time, attention, and resources were utilized for political gain by Zionists to problematize Muslims and further mainstream Islamophobia within the annals of American justice, rather than address the actual pervasive threat to Jewish, Muslim, and other communities stemming from the alt-right and white nationalism. One panel, titled Anti-Semitism on Campus, propagated the Islamophobic conspiracy theory that the Muslim Brotherhood, under the supervision of 95-year-old Yosef Kardawi, has infiltrated American universities through foreign funding of Middle Eastern studies programs. Charles Small, director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, built such claims off of data from notorious Zionist Daniel Pipes from the Middle East Forum. Small also claimed that a fifth column, red-green alliance, has been forged between the left and Muslims, two segments of the anti-Semitism tripartite, the right, the left, and Islam, that are often pro-Israel and pro-BDS and thus anti-Semitic. Referring to the red-green alliance as anti-American and anti-Israel manufactures individuals as subversives or extremists, disloyal to America and its allies, which can result in repressive responses by the state. On another panel titled Combating Anti-Semitism While Respecting the First Amendment, AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson referenced the white nationalist violence at Poway and Pittsburgh synagogues, but he ultimately made the case that it was the left in Islam that posed the real danger to Jews. He stated there can be no serious conversation about anti-Semitism without talking about the anti-Semitism propagated in the name of Islam. Isaacson explicitly identified extremist ideologies propagated in the name of Islam and the left, which is where the BDS advocates are often situated, as key sources of anti-Semitism, commensurable with the anti-Semitism of the far right, which accounts for the actual anti-Jewish attacks in the United States, according to data. Accusations of anti-Semitism work as the defense mechanism. Accusations of anti-Semitism work as a defense mechanism when deployed by Zionists that serve to stifle dissent, silence support of Palestine, and distract from racism that targets Arabs and Muslims. Yet in the United States, attacks and threats to Jews and houses of worship have been perpetrated by white supremacists with right-wing and neo-Nazi links, and a massive wave of threats to Jewish institutions actually came from an Israeli Jew. Muslims have actually raised money to repair damages to Jewish cemeteries following vandalization, supported families following the mass shooting by a white supremacist at the Tree of Life synagogue, and joined interfaith vigils following the killings at a Chabad in Poway, California. Yet such facts did not derail Isaacson from implicating Muslims for anti-Semitism and insinuating that hatred for Jews is inherent in Muslims and Islam. Despite Isaacson's record of Islamophobic statements, the AJC remains an interfaith partner with some segments of the Muslim American community. Specifically, it forms a portion of a Jewish-Muslim interfaith partnership with the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA, called the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, or MJAC. On the same panel as Muslim Interfaith Partners, AJC, the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, the deputy director, Elliot Zweig, pummeled the audience with Islamophobic propaganda video clips for 7.5 minutes of his allotted 10-minute presentation time. The MEMRI website appeals to the same historical revisionism as Islamophobic polemicist Bat Yor, claiming that the early roots of anti-Semitism are derived from the Quran, Muslim tradition, and classic Muslim literature that dates back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, confrontation with the Jew tribes of Arabian Peninsula. No differentiation at the summit was made between a wide swath of political, social, and theological views spanning several nations, ranging from professors to political groups to standard Friday mosque khutbahs, utilizing theological doctrine in suburban America, some of which appear to be captured on surveillance footage and taken from actual social media posts. Yigal Karman, a former chief anti-terrorism advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yitzhak Shamir, is credited as the pioneer of the field of ideological surveillance. He is also the founder of Memory in Washington, D.C., the hub of disinformation, and that the Islamophobia network relies on to make the case that Islam is inherently violent and promotes extremism. However, experts have accused Memory of selective and problematic translations of media in Arabic and for fanning the flames of Islamophobia through its propaganda. Memory has compiled a list of media clips and translations of khutbahs from 2004 to the present from across the globe that refer to the hadith discussed in the other section. On Memory's website, there is a section explicitly entitled Anti-Semitic Hadith, the prophecy of the rock and the tree. Further, by posting problematic sermons and political commentary by Muslims online without context, Memory functionally polices the speech of imams and Muslim organizations, including those in liberal democracies where speech, thought, and religion are protected categories. In one case, the charge of Islamic anti-Semitism was used to smear an imam in Davis, California, who referred to the hadith in his khutbah on Palestine. The complaint against him also cited his dua at the end. Ultimately, the American imam was pressured to issue a public apology. In this sense, even the prayers and supplications of Muslims are policed in America, not only by the US security state, but also by pro-Israel entities. And I'll end there because my time is over.
Very interesting, Paula. Where to begin? So much. We're seeing very good questions for this panel. Hopefully we can get to all of them. And so if you can keep your answers very limited, that will enable all of you to give final statements, a 1 minute, 2 minute final statement. So pretend like you are president of your favorite nation. And this is the question to you. Try to be brief, okay? First question I have for Steve Downs. And this is a question I've had for a while and has been forwarded to me. Why do judges go along with this? It's clearly fabricated evidence. It's clearly illegal. We're not talking about dismantling a legal structure of oppression. We're trying to dismantle a secret, illegal, unconstitutional. Why are so many judges allowing this?
I think in America, there has been a tradition for a while of, according to national security issues, a special place in the Constitution or above the Constitution. In other words, as long as something has to do with national security, judges are more willing to look past the violations of constitutional protections. It has its limits. Not all judges will do that. The truth will come out eventually. But I think it's simply because if you put something under the category of national security, you can get away with a lot more in the U.S.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. If you see something, say something. In follow-up question also to you, Steve, and also Asim, you mentioned a issue that I'm very keen on watching carefully, which is China's adoption of the United States policies and basically using its treatment of the Uyghurs, turning it back on the US, saying, how can you criticize us for what we're doing? Because this is a national security issue in China. We're fighting terrorism, we're fighting extremism. What is it going to take in terms of social conditions, legal conditions historically to get the political will to make some changes? Is this an opportunity right now where the US appears to have both Republican and Democratic support against China and its treatment of Uyghurs? Is now the time for the US to say, you know what you're saying about the Uyghurs is incorrect and we were wrong, and it's time to shut down Guantanamo and set this right?
Yeah, we have a lot of issues that we have to take care of. I think the Uyghurs are relatively low on the priority, and for most Americans, I don't think most Americans are really focused on that issue, though they should be. But it's a perfectly logical extension of the kind of policies that we've been following, and I think that's the first thing we got to do is shut down the war on terror.
Dr. Qureshi, what do you think? Do you see that there'll be any traction in terms of China's argument that the U.S. will? How can they keep the war on terror going in its current form and have this hypocritical attitude towards China?
Well, I mean, we've already seen China at various points over the last 20 years in its own kind of like human rights documentation, highlighting Guantanamo Bay specifically, rendition, torture, in the US. So I mean, ultimately this is a game. They all know that they're all involved in various forms of human rights abuses, and really the only thing that's going to shift anything is something that happens that's going to be damaging in some kind of economic way to one party's interests or the other. I mean, it's not really about the moral argument here, because if we were going down the route of the moral argument, then neither side comes off very, very well in this situation. We've already seen, I think it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, with the announcement by Nike and H&M in relation to the Uyghur, the immediate impact that had within China, and how there's this entire kind of flood of boycott Nike, boycott H&M coming about, which of course then sends the message that, oh right, we don't necessarily want to go too far in the way in which we kind of criticize our own corporate partners. So I think these situations are very difficult. One of the things that I learned from the lawyer who works in the UK and the US, his name's Clive Stafford Smith, many years ago, is that he said to me, and he says this quite regularly actually, that the law doesn't work. The only thing that states really understand is when they get embarrassed into acting, and that is a huge part of it. That we have to find ways to almost embarrass them into doing the right thing. That they're not going to do it on moral grounds alone. I think we've seen this not just in the last 20 years, but many years prior to that as well. That it's only effective when they are forced into a situation where they have to effect some kind of change. That is never due to goodwill alone or the force of goodwill, and that's never going to work.
Yeah, interesting. Money's an issue. I was happy to see that Nike and H&M were doing something. Hopefully they actually do something and don't just make the announcement, then keep doing what they're doing anyway. A lot of companies, when I worked as an analyst and following the money, you see these companies, Fortune 500 companies, immediate make a statement, we will do what's right, everybody back off, stop talking on social media, but then they just keep doing what they do anyway, expecting that nobody will follow up. We'll see what Nike does. Question for Kathy and Paula. What advice would you give in terms of how can the general public do something to help in these cases where you have countering violent extremism programs and this culture of, if your neighbor's a Muslim, now you're supposed to self-deputize and watch them every hour of every day? I was curious to see what cases you would mention, Kathy. I was waiting to hear if you would mention the two boys in Dearborn, Michigan, who were reputable, well-known in the community football players. A documentary was being made about them at Fordson High School. And as they were making the documentary about these boys fasting during Ramadan and playing football, they were arrested for suspicious terroristic activities. They were in Ohio buying prepaid cell phones for their family's convenience store. Basically, they had taken a trip to Ohio. They saw that the phones were a good price, and they said, this is great. Mom and Dad will buy a lot and bring them back to our store and we can sell them. We can make a good profit. And they were immediately arrested and they were charged with terrorism. Were it not for that documentary that was happening, I think those boys would be locked away forever. But because there was attention, there were cameras, the public was aware, they had to do what's right. They had to drop the case and basically apologize because people were watching. Is that the solution, that you should always be making a documentary about yourself if you're Muslim or brown in America?
Well, just I wasn't too familiar with that case. I think it's in our database, but not our report because they weren't convicted. And our report deals with the cases where people were convicted. But there are a few outliers where people weren't convicted because, like you say, people were paying attention, or they just got lucky with a good jury, one good person on the jury, whatever it might be. But I mean, it does help if people are paying attention. So that's one of the things we try to do is to, we haven't done this too much yet, but to have people come to court in these cases and support and speak out about how unfair the case is, even pre-trial and pre-sentencing. With Yasin or Ruff's case, we just thought they'd be acquitted. We didn't do it too much pre-trial, but we did it advocating for lower sentences, and they would have gotten 30 years instead of 15 years if it hadn't been for all of us vigiling outside the court every week and having lots of people write letters and petitions. It's still a horrible result, but better than it would have been. So it definitely helps if people pay attention to the cases. You don't have to be making a documentary. Certainly that helps, but get involved. And I think younger people, younger Muslims and younger people of all identities are willing more and more to speak out about the unfairness and all sorts of social justice issues. So I'm hopeful going forward that maybe there'll be less of these cases, hopefully.
Right. And Paula, I'm sure you're familiar with Al Jazeera's undercover report about the Israeli embassy utilizing local Jewish students to target Palestinian activists, actually sending cables through embassies back and forth, communication to literally target student activists and staging walkouts, trying to get the ADL involved with press conferences, really amplifying anything they could to label any form of Palestinian activism as supporting terrorism. If you are a student in college and you support human rights, if you support activism, what advice do you have if you're targeted and called an extremist and you have the ADL attacking you because you choose to be an activist?
Well, I would suggest that, you build allyships. And again, like Kathy mentioned, dissent, raise your voice and resist. I'm from the UC Berkeley campus, so it's a very vocal, very targeted. We had a lot of the white nationalists, back and forth during the time of Trump. And on our campus, BDS is a big issue. We have a very strong Zionist force, and my professor was targeted by Zionist groups, and so was another colleague at San Francisco State University. So these are real things that happen, and they just speak out, and so do the students, and you kind of make a circle of advocates and just continue to speak truth to power. I mean, that's what we consistently say in Berkeley. I really don't think that, the students are very active. They're just not going to sit down and take that. So I think we definitely have to speak out and just know your rights and continue to resist and be aware, educate yourself and educate others.
Good answer. I had a situation last year that I was accepted to speak at a conference. I had undertaken an ethnographic study about refugees stranded while traveling, specifically Palestinian refugees. My paper abstract was accepted. And I, on purpose, when I submitted the abstract, I left out the word Palestinian. I mentioned that it was an ethnographic study of refugees. And when I submitted further information, my invitation was revoked. And I was told that this is not academic, that it's activism. This was the University of Leeds. And I tell that to everybody. I will not support that university. How is it that by adding the word Palestinian, this very detailed ethnographic study by a lawyer isn't academic and it's called activism? I find that unacceptable. Question for you, Steve. This one I find interesting. He wants to know, this was specifically for you. What is your take on US support of the Mujahideen during Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the U-turn that the US has made ever since supporting the Mujahideen? Basically, let's say Charlie Wilson today is giving money to Afghanistan to fight and bring down Soviet helicopters. Do you think Charlie Wilson would be charged with providing material support to terrorism?
Yes, I do. Times have changed, and it's hard to compare one thing to another. I have to say it was a different time back then, and the world has moved on, and they see the world in different terms now. They see it in terms of labels that people apply to different things. I actually think Charlie Wilson was understood what was going on over there probably better than a lot of people today do, because we're more drawn to the label than we are to the reality on the ground. I'm not necessarily saying that the Charlie Wilson's war should have been repeated or that we should have more violence in Afghanistan, but I'm saying that I'm concerned that we are reacting more to labels now than we are to the reality on the ground.
Yeah, definitely. Question for you, Kathy. Somebody asked, is there a way to collectively propose all of these preemptive prosecution cases? Is there a way to bring these together in a case before the International Court of Justice?
That's something I can't really answer. Maybe Asim knows more, because I haven't really dealt with that. I mean, we looked into it a little bit in the case of Afia Siddiqui. There's a lot of obstacles there, and I can't really speak to the possibilities there as an overall thing. It's a great idea if we could do it. I don't know, Asim, do you know more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the ICJ is used between states. So it would have to be a state that would bring some kind of complaint against the US in terms of a violation. In terms of the International Criminal Court, then it wouldn't be possible because the US isn't signed up to the Rome Statute, which would make it impossible. Then also, the court really exists to provide a solution to a state where they claim themselves that they don't have the ability to look into that matter. I mean, I do think that, ultimately, the only way that we're ever going to really expose how ridiculous these laws are is unfortunately by exposing how ridiculous they are through sheer force of numbers. If you look at, for example, profiling stops in the UK under something that's called the Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, we're talking about tens of thousands of people who are stopped every single year and questioned about their comings and their goings, stuff that has nothing to do with whether or not they've been involved in the instigation, preparation, or commissioning of an act of terrorism. It's to do with questions around their belief. How often do you pray? How pious do you think you are? And if you refuse to answer a question within that interrogation, you've committed an act of terrorism. So you have no due process rights in that moment. It's the one, I could kill somebody in the streets right now and I have more rights than I do in that moment when you're stopped. I genuinely believe the only way we're gonna get rid of this piece of legislation is by clogging up the system with people who refuse to answer questions. It's the only way you can really highlight how ridiculous a situation we find ourselves in, where we are completely denied our due process rights, and it is a complete two-tier system. It's predominantly used against Muslims. So yeah, unfortunately, I think all of this requires more creative solutions than just the courts. I mean, that is still required. We still need to bring cases. We still need to defend people, but we do need to think more creatively too.
I want to give more time to you, Asim and Paula, on this issue of countering violent extremism and prevent programs. What do you believe is the real motivation for these government programs as they see and they try to justify and measure the unmeasurable crimes that haven't happened? I can say I just prevented 1 billion crimes. What's the proof? They didn't happen. See? And so how do they justify it? What's the rationalization? They know that it's angering the Muslim community, and they know that the program, if anything, would create more terrorism than stopping terrorism by taking away people's civil rights and harassing them. What's the real justification for these programs when they see that it's not effective within the Muslim community? They know it's not effective. They try to justify it and count and say that it is effective. What's the real justification that they continue?
I think that so in America, because we change presidents often, we change like CVE programs, and sometimes they can change kind of in the middle. For example, Biden hasn't come out with his yet. However, Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, was the state attorney of California, in charge at the time of overseeing CVE when it was a state issue, CVE funds and CVE programs. And of course, Biden was vice president of Obama and that whole CVE rollout. In my experience, it has been that the practitioners who engage or sort of run countering violent extremism tend to do a kind of like listening tour. I went to one, and Stephen Wayne from University of Chicago, the psychiatrist who is from START and who got a lot of government funding to like study Somalis and Minnesota and these things. He was present, and I feel like they just try to find out from the community using a native informant. In this case, it was MPAC Muslim Public Affairs, who ran the Los Angeles program Safe Spaces. They tried to find out what it is that would get Muslims to buy in, because if there's no buy-in, there's really no program. And if Muslims aren't buying in and Muslims aren't participating, then I really think it's, I don't want to say easier to challenge it in court, but you can point to one thing and say, this injustice is being done to us and we are resisting it, rather than having this divisiveness in our communities. And so people say, well, this group says this or this individual does this. So I found him just taking notes and hearing people say, and this was about 4 or 5 years ago, well, there's no countering violent extremism for KKK or white extremists, when you don't want countering violent extremism as the program of oppression for anyone, right? Yes, we do have these problems that need to be solved, but, and so for buy-in now, they were like, okay, well, there's this rebranding, right? So they said, now it'll be more inclusive countering violent extremism, where we'll go after white, extremists, but that hasn't happened yet. And it hasn't happened on the scale, and countering violent extremism was created for Muslims anyway, right? To silence dissent. And honestly, when I bring Islam, because I am a theologian from a theological university, into this, to me, Islam is a liberatory idea and theory and a theology, and anything that can liberate people is a target by the state. Anything that can pose a challenge, any people that can pose a challenge, have to be put to rest, have to be laid down, have to be controlled. And so this is the position that I come from in this. But as far as the other part of the question, I think Asim can answer that great. So I'm looking forward to that response.
Thank you, Paula. Yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying. And I think you can't separate the idea around CVE or terrorism policies in general from the discourse around nationalism and the way in which states kind of pander to stories that they tell themselves about who they are and what society is, and who is important. So for example, when there's a liberal discourse around we need to have a trade-off between our rights and our security, then really what they mean is we need other people who don't look like us to trade off their rights in order to keep us safe, right? That's really what's being said in those moments, but it's presented initially as a homogenous thing that, oh, we're all in this together, but it really isn't, because ultimately Muslims are not the constituency for the discourse of politicians. We're very rarely factored in as in an equation around what any politician requires from society. It's far easier to otherize us within dominant political discourse and through policy making than it is to, say, for example, adequately defend us from the racism that exists generally within society. It's quite easy to say, oh, there's a problem with Muslims and sex grooming gangs, for example, than it is to say, well, actually, let's look at the data around, how white people kind of are involved in these same types of activities at higher rates, and really go through it in a methodological way, right? That whose interest does it serve to say something like that? And so that's what you get caught in this. You get caught in this endless cycle of effectively this pandering to a dominant discourse that is tied to electoral cycles. Let's be honest, like it really isn't, I think, anything more deep than knowing who your constituency is and making sure that constituency will vote you in again in the next 4 or 5 years. I think it's really as simplistic as that. And when you tie that to ever increasing notions of nationalism, around white supremacy, around kind of all of these ideas that embed the dominant society somehow being the minority or being the other, then you end up in this kind of confluence of securitization and racism and nationalism all being mixed into this boiling pot. There is no reason why Muslims should be protected by politicians running for government. We're never going to be a popular enough cause to be defended in that regard. And I think people who think that somehow we are like the 5% that we are in the UK are strong enough as a force in a kind of an electoral system which is meaningless in terms of our numbers. I don't see why anybody would take that seriously. And that's just kind of me being realistic about it. I mean, obviously it's not a defeatist attitude in the sense I don't think that we should stop doing all the things that we're doing, but I also think that, CV is just too easy for them. They lose nothing by having this in place.
I agree. It's a political issue, and all of the studies and research keeps coming back to that point that terrorism, true terrorism, is a political issue. It's a nationalism issue. It's not a psychological. It's not a illness. It's a political. It's a nationalism symptom of political problems. I appreciate yesterday Bilal Erdogan, who's on the Waqf board of our university. He made a very important point in terms of why do we use the term Islamophobia. This almost excuses that it's okay, that maybe you have a reason to be phobia, scared of Muslims, and that it's justified. And he proposed that it not be used as a term Islamophobia, that people be identified as anti-Islam, anti-Muslim. It's not Islamophobia. Let's not try to give any legitimacy to these insane beliefs. I'd like everybody to take 1 minute. Again, Dr. Sami does a great job bringing all of these panels together. I tell him, too many speakers, too many ideas. We could have a lot of debate and additional questions. If there's something that you left out and you absolutely want to make the point right now, please take 1 minute. And then I'd like to conclude and announce our next panel that will begin in about 26 minutes. So everybody take 1 minute. Let's start with you, Dr. Qureshi.
Sure, thank you. I guess the one point that I'll leave everyone with is we should try and avoid a race to the bottom in relation to normalizing all of these policies for everyone. So this notion of, well, you know, we should call far right supremacists terrorists too and use CVE for them, like that is nothing that's going to help us in the long term. It just normalizes the harm because we are still the community that is predominantly targeted by these policies. So we should try and stay away from that in how we counteract what we're seeing.
Thank you. Very good. Steve Downs, 1 minute. Any final?
Yeah, I found this discussion fascinating. I really enjoyed listening to all of you, and in part because I think over in the United States, we're so much in a bubble. We just think, you know, we have this huge mess over here and we're the only people that are fighting with this. And I've enjoyed listening and realizing how much of the world is also involved in this in their own way, in very different ways, and how much there is interplay on the governmental level between all of these countries, trying to figure out what the best way to do it is, how do you control your Muslim population? How do you control your Muslim population? And we often lose sight of that the kind of cases that Kathy and I deal with in the courts, we don't see that geopolitical discussion all the time, but it's very real and it's very there. And it's really important that we keep this dialogue going so that we understand each other better. So I appreciate all of what you said.
Thank you. Very good. Kathy?
Well, I echo what Steve said, and it has been really fascinating. But I guess I wanted to mention a couple of challenges that we face with these cases, these prosecutions. One is that because the Muslim community here has been so terrorized by this war on terror, that they're afraid to speak up, and they're afraid they'll get charged if they speak up. So that's a big problem. Although, as I said, younger Muslims are starting to speak up more and be less fearful of that. And also because there's hundreds of people who are affected by this in prison, but there's not thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. So it's harder to build political power because it's not affecting, and even Muslims are a fairly small percentage of the population. So I think we need to build alliances with racial justice movements and criminal justice reform movements and say, look, we're part of this. Look at how egregious these injustices are, and please include us in any legislative proposals or reform movements that we'd love to work with you. And also we're like a canary in the coal mine, because when they go after one group, they're going to extend it to other groups too. So, I think we need to go in that direction of working with these other groups.
Very good. And Paula, final comments from Berkeley.
I just wanted to broaden the field of, countering violent extremism and these ideas beyond the state to the way that other groups and entities, even tech firms, work to securitize Muslims and Islam, and that lead to the restrictions, sanctions, and oppressions. And they essentially do the work of the state or the allies of the state. And also in these, I wanted to get to this also, but in, for example, the white supremacy meetings before Congress, Zionist organizations again say, well, for example, the ZOIA, they said, well, we have white supremacists and extremists, but look, what about the Muslims? And they asked the father of the 3 murdered youth in North Carolina during this time when he was talking about the pain that he felt from the neighbor killing his children in cold blood inside their apartment. Did you, one of the congressmen or senators said, did you teach your children to hate? And it was about white supremacy, and it became about Muslims and their violence again. And, the Zionist Organization of America representatives were there pushing the Islam is the threat against. So in these white supremacies and in these meetings about, anti-Semitism, we need to keep watch that Islamophobia isn't being reproduced, at a time when people are seeking justice, and these are American platforms, the annals of American justice, like these departments and these speeches, are just propagating Islamophobia, and nobody's challenging it. They're just being silent, like, oh, that's just a normal thing to say. And so we just have to be aware of the groups and the extent to how this is playing out.
Exactly. That's something that has bothered me the most this last year, watching the Black Lives Matter movement and the global momentum to decolonize, of changing the names of buildings, throwing away statues of these horrible historical figures, and then looking that the side that the ADL and these other organizations, they claim to defend and protect civil rights, and look at the position they're taking. They're showing up to these hearings and these meetings, and they're opposing Black Lives Matter because they don't want the momentum to then shift to Palestinian Lives Matter. They don't want it to be, they don't want to see collaborations between the Black Lives Matter movement, which has momentum, becoming Muslim Lives Matter. They're opposing it. How can these people that defend civil positions be fighting against it? That shows everything right there. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Our next panel will begin in 20 minutes. Session 3, the moderator is my colleague, very, very good, qualified individual, Uwais Han, who will be moderating the session, redefining the global war on terror and defining who is the terrorist. We have excellent speakers. What is terrorism? The global war on terror 20 years later. And our director, Dr. Sami El-Arian, Terrorism, State Violence and Resistance, the Case of Palestine. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. Everyone who has tuned in throughout the world, thank you for your patience and your tolerance with Zoom. Again, take a 20-minute break and please come back. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ubied. You did a great job.